Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to see a lot of familiar faces. And I have to sort of say up front that, as you know, we've been closed for the last couple of years, which has been kind of a drag, but we've also been thinking a lot about what we're going to be doing when we reopen. So this talk is going to reflect some of these thoughts, maybe even a kind of a little bit of a sneak preview of things to come, and testing ideas. So we've been very busy, and we've been also active on other fronts in terms of programming outside of the walls of our museum. But as curators from all the 4 departments in the museum, we've really been focusing on our collections. We're closed, but what I love about this image is that it's a textile. You see in the background this whole, it's great. So textiles are wrap the museum up. But we've really taken advantage of this time to really focus on what we're going to do, what we want to be. So besides digitizing our collection, which everyone I think is doing these days, we've been asking ourselves lots of questions about how we want to display our permanent collection. We're going to be getting 5,000 additional square feet for displaying our collection. How does the mix of historical and contemporary collection relate to the bigger question of what a 21st century design museum should be like, and how best to tell the stories that go with each of the objects? So as we look forward, we also find ourselves looking back, delving into our history, and looking for those elements that offer continuity and also a richer understanding of the present. So what we have found during this time of reflection, and what have we learned? Or more to the point, what have I found and learned in terms of textiles? And specifically about the textiles that we have collected since the museum's founding in 1897, and what do they have to do with collecting contemporary textiles, which is my main sort of focus. In other words, why is history important to what we do now? And why does collecting contemporary work help us to understand history? So I want you all to bear with me, at least for those who understand or know about the history of the Cooper-Hewitt, because I'm going to introduce a little bit of a historical background of the museum and how the founders set a course that is really, in many ways, still applicable today. And after this intro, I want to spend the rest of the time focusing on our textile collection, showing the connections between many of the works through primarily textile techniques, and then ending with some groupings around elements of design that have helped to guide the curators in their thinking about the collection. So we start with the sisters, and I'm sorry to say I'm missing one of the sisters, Amy. She was not a very photogenic woman or young girl, so I didn't have a portrait of her. And so anyway, but this is Eleanor and Sarah, who were actually the most active of the founders in terms of the formation of the museum, but there was Amy or Amelia. And as you probably know, they were granddaughters of Peter Cooper, who started Cooper Union, and they were daughters of Abram and Sarah Hewitt. And Peter Cooper had a vision in 1859, when the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Arts opened, that he wanted a museum to be part of the school. But it took another, say, 38 years before this vision was realized, and when the granddaughters opened the museum in 1897. But the Hewitts' daughters early on were exposed to the arts. Abram Hewitt took them to exhibitions, and as he said, placed within their reach his personal library, which contained everything from illustrated London news with woodcuts of the London and Paris expositions, books by Owen Jones, 24 volumes of Versailles and its galleries, etc., to travelogues and illustrated dictionaries. So just the right kind of library that girls at 14 or 15 would be very interested in, and but certainly educated them for what they were going to be doing. So at the age of 16, with their pocket money, they purchased at auction, purely for their own pleasure, half of a very important collection of textiles, which ranged in date from the 12th through the 16th century. And because they couldn't afford all of it, they decided to buy the ones that showed greater technical and artistic merit that really dated from the 17th to the 18th century. And Eleanor Hewitt, in 1919, wrote about sort of the formation of the museum in her little booklet. It was I think it was initially a little pamphlet that she did for a women's club, and it was called "Making of a Modern Museum." And as she recounted, museums were very far from their thoughts, since they had never seen one. But yet this purchase was the initial step, since it now forms a very valuable addition to this superb collection presented by J.P. Morgan to the sisters several years after the opening of the Cooper Union Museum. And here's the Cooper Union, and it was on the 4th floor of this building. And so now I want to just kind of show you some early installations, because I think, again, we've been looking at these installations and wondering how we can incorporate some aspect of this into our new galleries, because we've gone through very sort of iterations with designers and discussions with designers and what they want to see. And more and more we get this feedback that they want to see as much of the collection as possible. So it all sort of means that it's going to be densely packed. But here's a wonderful plan of the 4th floor, and it's hard to read, but this is where you would come up. This was the entrance, and this was kind of the entrance hall. So there would have been tables for work tables for scrapbooks. They would also had various objects here. And then they displayed the works chronologically, but also mixed by medium, so that you would get a sense of the whole sort of period in terms of the decorative art. So textiles was mainly up here. There was the famous collection of Declue drawings. There's costumes, I think, over here. Kind of a very mixed array, but very densely packed, as you can see, as you will see in some images coming up. One interesting rule that the sisters made was not to accept or exhibit objects later than the first quarter of the 19th century, but it gladly accepts one class of objects most essentially modern. So already they were making these connections between the historical and the modern, never defining really what modern was, but I would imagine the most meritorious objects of the day. As I said, the museum was arranged chronologically. Here's a gallery installation in 1925. Another same plan, more gallery installations. But the reason why they also decided to do it chronologically, as I said, was so that the artistic work of many trades and countries of the same period could be juxtaposed. So there could be, discussions about them as people came in to look at them. And they were displayed in very small sections, as you saw in that plan. There were very small rooms with very dense arrangement. Very dense. But according to the sisters, let me get back to the plan. The entrance here, as I pointed out on the right side, was the most important and meant the most in terms of its modernity. And it was the main workroom and the laboratory. And in contrast to the great hall of most museums, as Eleanor writes, the entrance is delightful, with empty spaciousness and with a few superlatively fine objects beautifully and singly displayed. Scrapbooks would have been placed, as I mentioned, on the tables around the objects for students and others to peruse and learn from. And in all of the galleries, there were work tables. They were all lined up against the windows, as you can see. In fact, Eleanor comments in Making the Modern Museum that more modern than all else in the use of museums is the fact that all work, canvases, objects may be left out at the owner's risk in the museum at the close of the day. So it was a real working laboratory. It was used as a research collection for students at Cooper Union. That was most important to the sisters. Let me get back to the working lab. The prestige of the collection was really put second. Because their collection was a practical working laboratory, the Hewitt sisters were determined to organize the collections in such a way that they might be greatest use to students and designers. They didn't want the tedious restrictions and formalities, but a real working museum for people who wanted to learn. This is what made their museum modern. Restrictions are eliminated, said Eleanor, except for the few necessary to protect the objects. The salient point is that the objects are there for use, to be worked from, and if so desired, to be removed from their position and placed in any light. They can be photographed or measured, and no squeezes or impressions taken. Naturally, constant use will have a tendency to damage, even destroy certain objects. But if in that time an artistic tradition passed on from father to son, the existence or non-existence of these objects will not seriously matter. And during all that time, the museum will have been fulfilling its destiny. So here you can see women, in this case, looking at the collection, sketching it from it, really utilizing as they had wished. But the museum was also for the community at large, these artisans or artisans-to-be that wanted to learn about certain trades in the decorative arts. In essence, the museum was formed to facilitate the free acquisition of knowledge in the arts, styles, and periods. Its practical relation to the artistic trades is, as Eleanor said, a first aid to the ignorant. So, the acquisition that really jump-started the textile collection was a gift from J.P. Morgan, who was a friend of Abram Hewitt, the Hewitt sisters' father. And Morgan gave that to the girls in 1901, which consisted approximately of 1,000 pieces. And this really established the historical scope of the collection, as it included work from the 5th through the 18th century, so Italian and French, Islamic, as well as Chinese textiles, and I'm showing you just a couple. And I just, so that I don't neglect the other departments, I wanted to show some other, certainly areas that we have about 160,000 drawings in our drawings, prints, and graphic design collection. Here's a few that date from that period for the Hewitt sisters, also product design and decorative arts. Very eclectic collection from, as you can see, from bird cages to chairs and everything in between. And wall coverings, so band boxes and lots of sidewalls and other types of wall coverings, and then of course textiles. And this one on the left was also from the J.P. Morgan gift. Basically what the Hewitts wanted more than anything was for artisans and students to understand technique. So unlike a lot of other textile collections around the world that are really subsumed within departments of European art and the like, the textile collection to this day is organized around technique. And those categories include woven, non-woven, including lace making, crochet, knitting, braiding, embroidery, and printing techniques through the gamut of all of those. So now I'm going to introduce you to the collection. I have aimed for image pairings that encompass a range of periods and geographical areas, much like I think the Hewitt sisters did in their early installations. So for instance, in this pairing we have a bazaar silk, which were produced in Europe for only really a short period of time, in the latter part of the 18th century. But they gained popularity by the early 1700s and were inspired by such exotic wares from Asia and Chinese porcelains, Japanese lacquer works, and Indian and painted printed textiles. Bizarre designs are identified by unique patterns incorporating strange and fantastical imagery. These draw-loom woven fabrics were often brocaded with colored and metallic threads against a subtle one-colored damask background. The layering of patterns and the manipulation of color, texture, and light added incredible visual interest. And they were woven as luxury goods in silk weaving centers in Venice, London, and Lyon. They were used primarily for clothing for the court and upper classes and for ecclesiastical vestments. And I'm pairing it with a textile by Jennifer Robertson, done in 2007, called Silk Banksia. And this particular textile was done while Jennifer was studying jacquard design and weaving at the Liceo Foundation in Italy in 2005. And the fabric was woven by the Bianchi company in 2007. Silk Banksia relies on the extraordinary weaving traditions and expertise of the Liceo workshop. Few places could replicate this unusually fine weaving, which comprises over 16,000 silk warp ends in a 150 centimeter width, achieving a density of about 110 ends per centimeter. The ability to have such an extraordinary quality ultimately led Robertson to work with photographic detail of an image of Banksia, which is an Australian native flower. The flower displays a vibrant movement of stamens and a high contrast of light and shadow. So by reducing the number of colors to only 5, she creates restraint without losing detail and gains a wonderful luminosity with the vivid orange that almost seems electrified. And to me, the two share that same kind of technical virtuosity as well as beauty. This next pairing, this is a rank badge that dates from late 14th to early 15th century. It's a Chinese rank badge. The cranes represent that the badge would have been worn by a civil official. Cranes symbolizing immortality and wisdom. This is considered a first rank square. And as you can see on the right, they would have worn these badges both on the front and the back of their robes. And I like to just compare it with Sheila Hicks, her kilometer 177.5, which was done in 2002, 2003. Similar technique, it's a tapestry technique, except it has 4 salvages. She weaves it on this this frame. This actually, I think, was exhibited here at Bard when Sheila's show was here. But there's a quality that reminds me of the rank badges that we just saw. Each has its own story or symbolism for her, and many of them use the tapestry technique, as you see in this particular example. In this textile, she started it as a weaving demonstration for her granddaughter, which then developed along the way. The title refers to the distance from Mexico City to the ranch where she lived in 1959. Although not to be worn as in the rank badges, the complexity of structure and the parameters of the tabletop loom with which they are made recall the earlier work. And moving on to printed textiles. This is the apotheosis of Franklin on the left, which represents the use of copper plate printing technique. The design is known as American Independence, or the apotheosis of Franklin, which shows George Washington standing in a chariot up at the top, drawn by leopards, and behind him a female figure holding a shield on which American Independence 1776 is inscribed. Benjamin Franklin is shown with the female figure carrying a liberty cap on a staff, and above them on a scroll it reads, "Where liberty dwells, there is my country." Printing from engraved copper plates had a brief period of popularity in the second half of the 18th century. An intaglio technique related to etching, it enabled finely drawn images to be printed from hand-engraved copper plates, measuring anywhere from 12 inches to 3 feet square. It enabled much finer drawings to be replicated on a larger scale than woodblocks could ever have done. However, it was difficult to print in more than one color since the fine detail caused problems with registration. Nevertheless, between 1760 and 1800 are some of the finest printed textiles. Most notable are the toiles de Jouy of the late 18th century, which were produced in the factory outside of Paris. Cylinder or roller printing is a direct descendant of copperplate printing, since the rollers were engraved in the same way, although the diameter of the roller was no larger than 30 inches. It was the first fully mechanized process, allowing an entire length of fabric to be printed continuously. The first successful machine patented was in 1783. Cylinders were engraved by hand. Roller printing revolutionized the industry, as it could do the work of about 40 hand block printers. And I'm pairing it, surprisingly, with Calyx by Lucien Day, which represents the screen printing process, which was first used in Europe during the 20s and 30s and was at first a hand process. The design is applied by coating and varnish those areas which are not to be impregnated by dye, and then the dye is forced through the screen by applying pressure from a squeegee. Each color requires a separate screen. This was automated in the 1950s, and instead of the screen moving along the fabric moves under each screen. Annie Albers, her textile Éclat, done in 1975, represents another example of a screen-printed process. Her foray into printed fabrics really began with her experimentation with lithography in the mid-1960s, and you can see an example of one of her pieces on the right. At that time, her husband Joseph Albers was asked to work at the Cameroon Lithographic Workshop in LA, where the head of the workshop encouraged Annie to try lithography. She experienced a newfound expressive quality in the medium, and by the 70s, printmaking had become her primary focus. This knowledge of printmaking, as well as her passion for the techniques, no doubt impacted her subsequent textile designs like Éclat. With the creation of this textile, which was used for drapery and upholstery, Annie Albers animates the surface with parallelograms that together create a dynamic three-dimensional effect, much like her lithograph on the right. And going to the opposite end, we look at Hitoshi Uji, also a printing technology, but he uses digital inkjet technology, which the variations in the color would not have been possible without the use of inkjet technology. While it's theoretically possible to print millions of colors with the 4-color printing process, Uji uses this color precision instead in the creation of these layered dimensional effects and subtle color blending. And it's even impossible for me to see at this point, but you can see these sort of lines along the textile. That's actually, they're words, and he has printed his whole thesis on digital inkjet technology onto the cloth, the background of the cloth. And there's sort of a close-up of one of the machines. So lace is another very important area in our collection. We have a really exquisite and rare collection of early needle lace and bobbin lace, as well as knotting and machine-made lace. We have about 2,500 pieces. And needle lace, which you see an example on the left, dominated fashion during the second half of the 17th century. Its bold patterns, worked in smooth buttonhole stitches with sculptured raised outlines, really recalls this feeling of carved ivory in the detailing. And on the right, we have an example of bobbin lace attributed to Dagobert Peche, but from the Wiener Werkstätte. But very different quality, as you can see, much more open work, and certainly not as detailed as the needle lace on the left. Another type of what could be considered embroidery is this idea of machine-made lace, which began in the early 19th century, and by 1851, at the time of the Great Exhibition, there were many admirable imitations of the beautiful Chantilly lace, which we'll see in a minute, and they were being copied using this machine-made process. It was not only, now I think it's much more difficult to find good machine lace that could correctly imitate certain types of needle lace, but it was a lot cheaper. It was about 75% cheaper than doing it by hand. By 1883, the chemical or burnt-out technique escalated the popularity of machine-made lace. This turned machine-embroidered patterns into lace by removing the ground fabric, and it was an excellent means of reproducing needle lace. The boom of hand and machine-made lace ended about after World War I. And I'm pairing this on the right with a 21st century surgical implant that actually shares the same kind of technique as this machine-made lace. It's machine embroidered. This would have been for a patient who needed to have his shoulder replaced, and was a way of attaching the new sort of artificial bone to the muscles. So this would have been a way of sewing part of the tissue to the body. But it was produced in exactly the same way, where it's actually embroidered onto a water-soluble base fabric, and then it's dissolved away. So the same kind of burnout process. We have lots of samplers, over 1,000, ranging from 17th to 20th centuries from all over the world. The sampler on the left is by Alicia Lawrence, and it's a record of her for her family. The entire ground is covered in black cross-stitch, with the family dates worked in colored silks, followed by a verse and inscription, and at the bottom 2 cornucopias of flowers. The verse reads, "Improve every moment of youth while you may for life, while you may for life, while you may, for life is too short to be trifled away." Sorry, kind of got that rhythm wrong. And then on the right is this darning sampler done in 1733, which really is kind of a wonderful creation of modern art in itself. And the whole sort of idea of darning is taking away, subtracting from the fabric, and then in this case it was testing their virtuosity and technical skill in doing this needle weaving, which was all these squares are examples of needle weaving. So you'd have a hole, and then you'd have to weave using various different types of structures to fill in that hole. And I'd say a 21st century kind of comparison is with Hella Jungarius, who was very inspired by our sampler collection. This is an installation that we had in 2005 when she was invited to mine our collection, be inspired by it, and then respond to it. So she did it with these sample blankets that you see on the right. And she collectively titled this series Sampler Blanket. And each work was inspired by certain historical samplers in the collection. And she took various motifs from those samplers and blew them up, used recycled materials to cut out some of these motifs, and then they were joined to the foundation fabric, and then using a relatively modern technology called needle punch. They all fastened themselves to the base fabric, sort of creating these needle punch fabrics that you see on the right. We also have an amazing collection of sample books. These contain examples of both product or technique that are really tangible tools which link together design, technology, and marketing. They've been used for more than 300 years, but are most prevalent between the 18th and 20th centuries. And we bring it up to the present, to the 21st century, with this book by Alabama Chanin, or Natalie Chanin, who's a fashion designer. And she celebrates many of the local traditions in Alabama in relation to stitch work and quilting traditions. This is a sampler in the most traditional sense, as a record of stitching techniques to be used as an aid to memory, as well as to share techniques with others. but it also embodies many of the most important design concepts of the 21st century, which is the idea of organic, local, sustainable, slow, and socially responsible. The company is based on the values embedded in the quilting tradition, so the idea of reusing materials, etc. This book represents a contemporary translation in knit jersey of a variety of traditional techniques, including embroidery, applique, reverse applique, couching, beadwork, and more. So it's a very personal kind of diary of her techniques, but something that was meant to be touched, shared, and also displayed. One of my favorite pieces in the collection, I think, are the more humbler pieces, and this is certainly one of those. This is a German sampler, which is all about a celebration of the buttonhole stitch. And it's just an incredible work of art. And I like it in comparison with this very different piece, which is a ceremonial dance skirt from the Congo, probably from the late 19th, early 20th century, that also used the buttonhole stitch for decoration. And you can see these little holes are all sort of buttonhole stitches to create this beautiful decorative patterning. This Cameroon hat, we have costumes in the collection. This would be considered a costume, but they're always in relation to process and technique. Traditional African hats have really expressed the diversity of the continent. The hat may serve as a religious or ceremonial function, or indicate the occupation or the hierarchy of the wearer in civic or social societies. It can also indicate the marital status of the man or the woman. In Cameroon, hats are one of the oldest and most important parts of the national dress. There are several types of hats worn in the Cameroon grasslands, and this is an achetou, or prestige hat. It's generally reserved for elite males as well as a very limited number of elite women. It fits very snugly on the head, as you can see in that sculpture on the right. And the crocheted hat supports these projections or burls that are on both sides. The whole crown of the hat may be covered with burls, or as in this example, it may be divided on the left and right sides by vertical lines of color. The burls are a reflection of the tufted hairstyle worn by high-ranking men of the Cameroon culture. And a very different type of crochet is this crocheted hyperbolic plane. The distinctly crenulated, irregular, and wavy features exhibited in this textile are reminiscent of forms seen in living corals, which are examples of and this particular piece is an example of a mathematical structure known as hyperbolic space. The discovery that this type of geometric structure could be modeled in crochet was first made in 1997 by Dr. Dinah Tamina, a mathematician working at Cornell University. Her inspiration was based on suggestion put forward in the 1970s by an American geometer, William Thurston. Thurston's model, however, was made of paper and taped together, making it inherently fragile and hard to handle. Tamina found that the essence of this construction could be implemented with crochet by increasing the number of stitches in each row. With each increase, the surface naturally begins to ruffle and crenulate. The result is a model with the cohesive surface and dynamic form that exhibits many of the intrinsic properties of hyperbolic space. Because of the creation of this model, these properties are now not only visible, but can be experienced through handling the surface, making this textile really an excellent learning tool. And proceeding to knitting, this late 18th century knitted hat, most likely from Spain. Knitting is a looped process that the fabric is made from a continuous supply of yarn, usually by hand, but also by machine. The origins of knitting are a bit obscure, since so few early examples survive. Some of the earliest examples of knitting are stockings from Egypt, around 12 to 1500. Also, knitted liturgical gloves were common in Europe after 1500. Hand knitting became a suitable pastime for the ladies in the 17th through 18th centuries, from which this cap dates from. So I'm comparing it with this. This is one of those extreme textiles, this core cap cardiac support device, which is basically a knitted mesh bag used to treat enlarged hearts. It has the ability to expand and contract for the beating of the heart, but acts as a restraint at the same time. Pleating. This is a pleated Mao skirt. They're scattered all, the Mao are scattered all across the Guizhou province in southern China. And what's, I think, important for us is that textile traditions remain integral to their culture. And this skirt represents the most common piece worn by all women, which is this indigo-dyed pleated skirt. And there are various methods to constructing a pleated skirt. Here is another version of it. One type, which you see at the top two images, is pleating done on a platform which consists of thin bamboo mats placed over a bundle of straws. The cloth is placed face down on a platform and dampened with a brush dipped in water. Pleating begins by pinching the end of the cloth from center to sides using one's toes to pinch and anchor. A heavy stone is laid on top of the pleated cloth overnight to firmly set the pleats. Peaks of the pleats are stitched together. In other areas, a barrel is used as a pleating platform, and then fingers pinch the fabric to form the pleats. Then ropes are firmly tied around the barrel to secure the pleats in place. The cloth is left to dry for 10 days before the ropes are removed and the fabric is unwound. As a final step, the skirt is rolled up tightly and bound with a cloth rope, setting the pleats firmly in place. And that's this example. I think it's on the right, actually. And yet another version, a board, and this is on the left, is placed on the lap, serves as another pleating platform. Using one fingers to pinch and tuck, pleats are made. The peaks are stitched to keep the pleats in place. Then the fabric is stretched on a frame to set the pleats, and that's what you see here. A very different pleating process takes place with designer Reiko Sudo's origami pleated scarf, which this is the final version, but these are what leads up to it. And again, sort of the hand is very much a part of this, just as in the previous pleating process. But you begin with an origami mold that you tuck using chopsticks the fabric into the mold, and then it goes through a heat set process with sandwiching between pieces of transfer print process, which actually transfers the dye onto the scarf itself. Going on to felt. This is a mosen, which is a type of rug used in Japanese tea ceremonies, dating from the late 19th century, and it was made in China for the Japanese market. China was Japan's main source for wool felt, and although they are not rare, these mosen, usually they show extreme wear. They're not rare, but they show extreme wear. Most of them were shibori dyed, as you see here, which is a tie-dye technique, and because the felt was often quite thick, this technique was particularly challenging. Felt is a fabric formed by applying pressure to hot, wet fibers, usually wool, and the fibers become interlocked and the process cannot be reversed. It is one of the earliest forms of textiles and is known in many parts of the world, though it has been particularly important in the Middle East and Central Asia. Although it is not really flexible enough for general use as clothing, felt's ability to stretch and mold and its excellent insulating qualities have made it particularly suitable for rugs, blankets, hats, waterproof cloaks, and tent-like structures in areas of extreme cold. Achieving a similar visual quality of shibori in felt is this slice designed by Lena Fransen, a Danish designer. The concept for the slice, done in 2003, was the culmination of 20 years of experimentation with felt. This piece is technically skillful and it showcases the material qualities of felt, that it can be formed into three-dimensional objects, can be made dense enough to provide structure while maintaining a desirably soft surface hand, and visual patterning is accomplished in the same process that makes the material itself. The design is built up by layering fibers of varied colors, and the composition is rolled and felted with a remarkable degree of consistency through this now enormous roll of wool fiber. Once felted, the log, which you see on the right, is cut into slices, creating patterns resembling the annual rings of a tree trunk, with each piece being unique and non-replicable. It is one material throughout and one single process from raw material to finished three-dimensional product, which is typically used as a seat cushion, but upends the notion of upholstery and filling interior and surface. So that's a quick overview. So where does that leave us now in the throes of planning how our collection will be seen, used, experienced? As I have mentioned, the sisters have helped to set us on a course which also gives the curators pleasure in deviating from, while understanding the reasons why. Long after the Hewitts died, the Cooper Union Museum organized an installation called Elements of Design in 1961. It was a guide to a permanent changing exhibition suggesting the nature of the museum's collection and the uses they serve. We have been discussing these elements of design as one way to elucidate our own collection. So like the Hewitt sisters, visitors to the museum will be informed participants rather than only informed viewers. So I'm going to just go through a few of these to explain what we mean by some of these elements, and showing you, again, some pairings of textiles that I think accomplish these, or good examples of these elements of design. So surface, which also could be texture, records or creates the textual character of an object. So here we have a 17th century example of needle lace and a mid-19th century Japanese sweat protector, which is made of paper, rolled paper. Form. Form defines an object's shape and its structural relation to space. Shapes are largely inspired by either functional necessity of shapes admired in nature. The 17th century tassel and this wall hanging by Mary Walker Phillips of 1964, I think are very, although one is quite small and one is much larger, they all occupy space in some way. They relate to space. They define the space that they're in. Line. Linear design is most often a natural result of a designer's use of particular materials. Function is a further determining influence on linear design. Its use, shape, and technique explained through the individual nature of linear design. So on the left, we have a 19th century Chantilly lace parasol cover. And on the right, we have a textile from 1998 by Akihiro Kaneko, which uses a jacquard woven process and inserts that black sort of undulating line is paper, using paper as the weft. Color. Color is the most commonplace of visual luxuries. The results of intuitive uses of color by artists, craftsmen, and designers are themselves a result of scientific research. There's no color without light, according to the laws of physics, and all color is constantly changing as light itself changes, however imperceptibly. Color can be naturally created or artificially manufactured in ways that are essentially chemical in origin and technique. Color can be used as a symbol, rank, ritual, or method of identification, such as you see in this 13th century red velvet on the left, or in another example by Hitoshi Uji using digital inkjet technology, where millions of variations of colors can be made. Rhythm, or pattern possibly. Rhythm is more often associated with music and poetry than with visual design, but is nevertheless an integral part of the designer's craft. An orderly repetition of pattern, color, or motif, rhythm produces exactly the same stimulus for the eye as does verbal or musical rhythm for the ear. variations in pattern ranging from a simple multiplication table to the beads of an abacus create rhythm. So I'm going to end it here. I think it's been about 45 minutes. And with the hope that you are crazy in anticipation of what we'll be doing for the reopening and that you will come in 2014. So thank you very much.